Hello and welcome to the Comic Conspiracy Podcast, episode 612 for the week of Monday, April 29th, 2024. My name is Ryan Higgins. We have a very special episode of the podcast for you this week. A couple of weeks we've recorded a few interviews. We're going to play those here for you now. First is with Sabir Pirzada, who's the writer behind, worked on Moon Knight and Miss Marvel for Disney+, but also is doing a comic upcoming for Image Comics called Dandelion. Talk to him about that series, as well as Patton Oswalt and Jordan Blum. Know them from many, many things. Of course, we're going to be talking to them about their current series, Minor Threats from Dark Horse Comics, and their upcoming Barfly miniseries as well as part of that Minor Threats universe. So hang tight. Here's the interviews.
Hey everyone, it's Kevin Sharp, and I'm here with Brock Sager and our special guest, Sabir Pirzada, a writer who has done both comics and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Sabir, welcome to the Comic Conspiracy, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, you've got some big news to talk about that we'll get to in a little bit, but we want to start, typically when we have a guest on, we talk about the guest's secret origin as a comic book fan. And so if you could just take a minute to tell the listeners kind of where you grew up and what your first exposure was either to actual comic books or to the comic book characters if they reached you through some other channel.
So the first comic book I ever read was a team-up between Spider-Man, Storm, and Luke Cage. And the villain was a guy named Smokescreen. And it was like this sort of special PSA comic, like sort of encouraging people not to smoke, essentially. And I took that lesson to heart, and I've never smoked in my life. But it was something that a friend of mine had just sort of given me out of his own collection. It was a free comic. It was not for sale anywhere. And that sort of introduced me to the medium where I was like, thought, this is cool. This is like a team up where any hero can kind of show up and go on an adventure together. I didn't really dive fully into comics until I visited my cousin in India, who had this massive comic collection, mostly Marvel stuff, but he did have some DC stuff as well. And there were rolling blackouts in India at the time, so we couldn't really go outside the apartment and do much. So I dove into his comic collection heavily and completely just fell in love with the medium and this sort of shared universe of all these different characters, and started my own collection promptly afterwards and never looked back.
So when you started that collection of your own, what were the first titles that you actively went after? If you had a chance to collect titles, or were you just seeing them at random?
Yeah, I mean, I would just pick out whatever looked cool on the shelf. So there was a team up between the Flash and Nightwing that I thought was cool. I think Mark Waid had written it. So I was diving into the Flash a little bit. There was Batman versus Predator. I remember reading that and thinking that it was violent but awesome. And so it was very much just whatever looked cool on the shelves in terms of what the cover was. That's what I would pick up. I wasn't really aware of, who was writing these comics or who was drawing them. All that awareness kind of came much later on for me.
And can you remember when you're looking back now, when you first became aware of kind of who wrote the comics? Since I'm asking this, since you're on the writing side, when you became aware of kind of the author's voice in comics, did you have any first favorite writers or writers whose kind of voice you were attracted to?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. The earliest that I can definitely remember was when the Ultimate Universe was being launched. So it was, and a lot of that is because those comics were available digitally. Is that you could read Ultimate Spider-Man and Ultimate X-Men for free, I think, on Marvel.com. And so that's when I started to become familiar with the names a little bit, that this guy, Brian Michael Bendis, was writing Ultimate Spider-Man, and this other guy, Mark Millar, was writing Ultimate X-Men. I may have been following writers even before then, but that's the first time I can distinctly remember those names on the covers and then following those writers as they went on to other things.
So you were able to follow writers independent of what character they were on. Was that something that appealed to you, following a writer book to book?
Yes, very much so. Once I started to be able to identify, okay, Bendis has his own style. It's a little bit wordier than Millar's, which is a little bit more action heavy. And then at the time, I think I may have been reading some of Paul Jenkins' Spider-Man. I think he had done Peter Parker Spider-Man at the time. And his was more like a slice of life type of style. And that started to open up different worlds for me in terms of just understanding the possibilities of what kinds of stories could be told, even with the same character, just among different voices.
So, how about for you yourself as a writer? I know that comics weren't your first stop as a pro writer, but did you ever have an inkling when you were younger about I might want to do this?
Yes. So
Writing
actually, for me,
specifically for comic books.
yeah. So for me, comics actually came first before TV. It was something that I think later on in the late years of high school, I started to discover a love for writing comics because I had a friend of mine who was an artist, and I saw his notebook full of all these really interesting sketches. And this was the first person I ever met who had talked about wanting to be a professional comic book artist. And that idea got lodged in my head as something one could actually do. I didn't realize that you could just say that that's what you're going to do when you get older. And that got my gears turning in terms of, well, could I write comics? Because, I've been at this point collecting and reading them for almost a decade. And so then I started to write comics for him to draw. And even that wasn't enough. So then I started looking online for artists who were willing to sort of draw some of these shorter scripts that I had, and eventually started to pull my own, resources together to see if I could hire an artist to do something on a more professional scale, and then submit it to publishers. And even getting a rejection from a place like Image when I was a senior in high school was very inspiring to say, oh, I got a response at least. Somebody is looking at this and at least considering it, even if it was a fast no. And so I never really gave up on that dream. I continued to write comics and find artists online to draw them, put together these pitch packets, try to get to the finish line. I think one of the earlier mistakes that I made personally was that I set my ambitions a little bit too high in terms of trying to make like a 64-page, supersized first issue of what I imagined was going to be a 36-issue series. It was just something that would take too long to put together on the budget that I had, which was, going at a snail's pace in terms of hiring an artist to do the work. And if I were to go back in time, I would just tell myself, hey, start smaller, make smaller comics. You can still use those as samples. And you could probably learn from yourself over and over again by making these smaller samples and taking what you've learned into the next product. But at least you'll get to the finish line and have a finished story that you could show. Because I hadn't learned that lesson, I kind of never did. I just kept having these indefinite projects that would go 30 pages out of a 64-page issue and then would kind of fold on itself in terms of me running out of money or the artist taking another job or just kind of dropping out of the art world altogether. There were a lot of false starts for me in terms of comic book writing. And in the meantime, I was exploring writing in other fields. I was exploring the idea of screenwriting. And so that's where the TV industry kind of caught up to what I was trying to do in comics, in terms of then I had a day job as an assistant trying to work in television. And that was financing the snail's pace that I was going at in terms of trying to make original comics and original graphic novels, where I would pay an artist 1 page a month to try to get to the finish line on one of those things. And it literally took me probably somewhere around 10 years by that point that I had finished any comic sample that I thought was actually worthy of getting published or at least sharing with professionals who would consider it. I already had several TV credits under my belt. And it really wasn't until these things lined up where I had already written some projects for the MCU, even though they hadn't come out yet, that helped me get the attention of Marvel Comics. And we can talk more about that if you'd like.
Oh, definitely. I was just going to ask, what was the first pitch that, when you put your pitches together, what was the first one that got a positive kind of bite? You mentioned getting rejected early on as a lesson, but how about what was the first one that got a yes?
Well, I guess it depends on your definition of a worthy response. So the first one that got published with a publisher that isn't me just self-publishing was a publisher called Arcana Comics, and they responded well to an action series that I had. It was a 4-issue series that I wrote with this artist named Eliseo Gouveia, a very talented artist, and we put together a series called Affliction, and it was basically a sort of a riff on the Messiah type of story, where it's like a guy finds himself cursed that anybody who sort of comes near him ends up dying. And so he finds himself sort of exploring these different properties of plants around him instead grow fast. And so he's just discovering that the rules of life and death just don't apply to him in the same way. They apply in very different ways. And then people sort of want him for these abilities and they chase after him. So that was very much an action series, lots of action sequences in it. Pretty light on plot, but some fun ideas that I was eager to explore at the concept level that helped me sort of dip my toe into what it's like to build a world. So That was the first comic I remember like getting some type of a positive response. And indeed, Arcana Comics did publish it.
Well, you're certainly describing a scenario that's kind of living the dream for aspiring comics creators, which is making your own early on, and then eventually you break through, kind of break into the castle, so to speak. But also you've got this other field going on the other side. So I think what everybody is probably wondering is what path leads you to Marvel out of all of this?
I mean, I'm sure if you would ask any writer who has worked at the MCU, like they would have a different response to that. In my case, it was actually fortuitous circumstances that I happened to be working on another program for Disney Plus at the time, which I'm not even sure if Disney Plus had a name yet. It might have just been called Disney DTC, I think, direct to consumer. And this was a program called Book of Enchantment. And so this program was supposed to be an imagining of the Disney fairy tale villains and what would happen if they all sort of lived in like a Game of Thrones style, medieval universe. And it was supposed to be the darker secret origin of these villains. And we were very excited to do it. But at the time, I don't think anybody really knew like what the boundaries were in terms of how dark or how kid friendly you had to be for Disney Plus. Now, the places that didn't need to really fall in under those lines in traditional ways were Marvel and Lucasfilm, because they were sort of at the time seemed like they could kind of operate in their own field because they had their own universes already and people knew what to expect from that brand. So what killed that project, Book of Enchantment, the timing of that kind of ended up being so perfect in terms of, it was unfortunate that show went down, but it was the same exact week that my manager got a phone call from Marvel Studios saying, is Sabir available to staff on one of our shows? We cannot tell you what it's for, though. And my manager said, well, he's on this show right now that is probably getting canceled, but it's not canceled yet. They said, okay, well, call us back if it is, but until then, we can't tell you what this is about. So they hang up on us. 3 days later, sure enough, Book of Enchantment gets canceled. My manager calls him back. He says, okay, Sabir's available now. They say, great. And then 2 days later, D23 happens, and they announce 3 shows, which is Moon Knight, Ms. Marvel, and She-Hulk. And so by that point, I had a pretty clear expectation that I was up for a job on Ms. Marvel. And that's because Ms. Marvel is about a Pakistani-American Muslim teenager living in America. And so I had a lot in common with that character, and that character has been beloved to me from the time she debuted. And I'd been following that series, every month. So I was very excited about that possibility that they could possibly do a Ms. Marvel TV show. And sure enough, that Monday, I was meeting with Bisha K. Ali and the executives. Bisha K. Ali was the head writer on that series. And the executives of Marvel Studios who were running that with her. And so, we hit it off right away, and I walked out the door with a job offer on that. And, next thing I knew, the next week I was starting on Ms. Marvel. So it was really my work on Ms. Marvel that opened the door for me to do more work on Moon Knight and some of these other projects.
So when you mentioned you're a fan of Ms. Marvel in the comics form, when Moon Knight came along, how were you familiar with that character from comics? That character has kind of been off and on, hot and cold for most of his history. What was your experience with him?
Well, not only was I familiar with him, I dressed up as Mr. Knight for Halloween, and I made sure that the Moon Knight executives at Marvel Studios knew that I was a hardcore fan of Moon Knight. And it was a running joke in the Ms. Marvel writers' room that I was eager to ditch them to go join Moon Knight, which was not true. I loved my time on Ms. Marvel. Both of those series are beloved to me. So, you can't pick a favorite out of those two. But I was definitely a very big fan of Moon Knight, particularly the Charlie Houston run with David Finch. I think that's a fantastic run on the character. That's kind of what got my attention. And then later on, the Declan Shalvey run as well, and many others. So, no, by the time the opportunity came around for me to actually work on Moon Knight, I hit the ground running. I was very familiar with the character and could dive right in.
Can you give the listeners a little bit of however you like to approach this, an insight in now that you've written for comics, the characters in comics as well as the characters for the screen? Obviously, you're in a writer's room on one of them, but is there something fundamentally different for the writer's craft in approaching them in those two different ways?
Yeah, I mean, in comics, I've felt almost encouraged to sort of dive into the existing continuity, no matter how dense it is, no matter how many decades back it goes. Whereas, at least for the Disney Plus of it all, I don't know that this was necessarily going to be the case for all the movies, but we were very much encouraged to say, hey, make sure you keep this as a fresh introduction for this character and make it friendly to people who don't necessarily read comics, are not necessarily well versed in even the MCU, that this could be a good entry point for them. And so that was the approach we took with both Ms. Marvel and Moon Knight, which is, okay, if this is the first introduction to anything in the MCU, how do we navigate that so that people don't feel bogged down by having to have seen whatever it was, 23 movies before and maybe a couple of TV shows. So that's what it was. And that was actually strangely liberating in a way, where we realized we didn't have to be beholden to so much. There were certain things we had to tiptoe around, especially when we get into sort of concepts of like the afterlife when it comes to what that looks like in Moon Knight compared to what other depictions of it have been in other versions of the MCU, or I should say within the same MCU. It's all the same place. So we did run into those things from time to time, but generally speaking, it was like blank slate, use your character's POV as the entry point for the audience, line those things up, and then have fun with it. And don't feel like you need to get things exactly letter perfect to what the comics were doing. To the degree that those things were good and inspirational to you and they open up story, great. To the degree that those things may be prohibitive in some ways in terms of the ongoing nature of what the character's role is going to be within the MCU, don't worry about those things. And the executives and Kevin Feige and the brain trust over there at Marvel will always be there to encourage you to take certain swings and will pull you back if they already have plans in certain areas that you may be bumping up against that you were not aware of.
As somebody coming in as a reader of those two characters, were you able to divorce yourself from your fandom to kind of just be, I don't want to say just, so I'll put it in air quotes, to just be a writer for the TV viewers?
You know, I sort of deliberately took it upon myself to be the one person who didn't do that. You know, I think it was important to definitely have that perspective in there because that's going to be the majority of your audience. You know, as much as like so many of us do love Moon Knight, I don't know that there was a big enough audience of Moon Knight readers who were going to tune into the Moon Knight TV series, given how much it costs to make, to justify being so beholden to that, you know? So somebody had to be aware of that. But at the same time, I also wanted to say, hey, there's really good stuff here. We also need to make sure we're mining the right stuff and honoring it. To the degree that we're making changes, let's make sure that those changes are working. But if I feel like those changes are going too far and now we're no longer, you know, honoring what I love so much about Moon Knight, what so many other readers love about Moon Knight, we may have lost our way here. So let's take another look at how we can mine these things a little bit more. So it was very difficult. And that's why I think it helps so much to be a part of a writing team, because the other writers around you can sort of plug in the holes where you may be missing things and vice versa. So, but you know, look, the tone of Ms. Marvel has been so clear and so perfect that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel tonally. We definitely wanted to live up to that and say, okay, if you're watching the Ms. Marvel show, it should feel like a Ms. Marvel comic. In the space for Moon Knight, well, there have been so many different iterations of Moon Knight that at that point we had to kind of pick and choose what were the versions that we wanted to do and make sure that we were kind of running towards that and not make it feel like it was just this sort of hodgepodge combination of 10 different versions just because we had access to them.
Well, we go from there to your time writing Miss Marvel on the comics page. How did you come to that from, did the MCU kind of feed directly into that comics assignment?
Yeah, in a surprising way it did. So Ms. Marvel has a TV series had not come out yet. In fact, I think I was in Budapest on set filming Moon Knight when I got an email from an editor at Marvel Comics named Darren Shan, who had an opening for a 5-page story in an anthology called Marvel's Voices Identity, and he was looking for a writer to write a Ms. Marvel story. And it had come to his attention that I was this writer who had written on the TV series and had aspirations in comics, and he took it upon himself to actually read one of my self-published graphic novels that I had written on Comixology. And he enjoyed that. And so he said, well, would you be interested in writing this comic? And I said, I would love to. Here's the problem. I'm on set for Moon Knight. I'm really short on time. And he said, well, it's only a 5-page thing. Do you think you could swing it? And, you know, there was no way I could say no to that, even though I really didn't have much time at all because it was a dream job for me. So I mainly wrote it in the transpo van on the way to and from set. for a few days and going back and forth in terms of getting notes from Darren Chan and then revising it with the short window of time that we had. And then after we finished filming Moon Knight, I came back and literally the day I got back from Budapest after being out there for 5 to 6 months was the same day that comic came out. So it was a really good feeling to sort of, touch down in Los Angeles for the first time in many months and then go to a comic store and get to pick up this comic that I had worked on at the same time. And that was, I think something like 9 months before the TV show for Ms. Marvel came out. So in that time, I actually had the opportunity to go back to the Ms. Marvel TV series because they were still making changes on that and they needed a little bit of help figuring out, how to make some changes in post-production and even continue filming. And so I had the unique opportunity to then title the episode of Ms. Marvel that I had written after the comic, the 5-page Ms. Marvel comic that I had written, even though the comic sort of came later, or I should say came in between the TV work. So retroactively, it was named Seeing Red, which is the name of the story title in that Marvel's Voices identity anthology.
And when you went back to writing comics, or, even for a 5-pager, was the old fire still burning? The old muscles were still in shape after your time in TV?
Yes. Oh, 100%. I had never really given up on that dream in terms of like writing comics. It was even at the time that I was working on Moon Knight, I was still also working on other independent comics that I was planning to submit. One of which was a project called Dandelion, which is an original graphic novel that comes out in June of this year. So some of these things have been really long projects that have just taken a long time to get off the ground. But the intention was always to sort of get back to them even when I was busy on the TV stuff.
Well, perfect segue to Dandelion. I was originally going to ask you about your after coming from one of the big two. I was going to ask you about your intro to creator-owned work, but it turns out it's not your intro at all to creator-owned work, given your self-publishing from before. So, how did Dandelion originate? Actually, let's back up. If you could tell the listeners what is Dandelion as far as a concept goes, and then how did that originate back in the day, if you remember, originally?
Yeah, so Dandelion is an original graphic novel that I've written. It comes out on June 12th of this year with Image Comics. It is an anthology of short stories that are all interconnected to each other. So they're all set in the same continuity, even though there's different artists who sort of contribute, and some of which sort of come back around. So they'll write multiple, they'll do the artwork for multiple stories, sometimes featuring the same characters, sometimes not. And it's essentially, for those of you who have seen the movie Nomadland starring Frances McDormand, that's about the closest thing I can think of that's kind of like this. It's basically about people who live in trailer homes, except in this version, these trailer homes are in the skies and it's in the future. And it's basically about what I consider to be the two inevitabilities that are going to reach us in the next couple of decades. One of them is climate change, which is going to wipe out a lot of homes, and the other is automation, which is going to wipe out a lot of jobs. So then we're sort of left with a lot of people who are displaced and, in need of help. And the question is, what does that help sort of look like when you're dealing with people who don't really want to give up what's theirs in order to help others? And so that happens to coincide with the invention of this technology that allows for these ships to sort of float in the air indefinitely, called dandelions. And so that becomes the solution, which is basically, let's send these people into these trailer homes, and these trailer homes can cluster together to form these globalized civilizations. And they've got these drones that leave the trailer homes, go out, pick up food or the ingredients to make food and bring it back to these trailer homes that can then synthesize the food so that they never have to leave. And so it explores the consequences of creating this technology and how that technology is perhaps used against the wishes of its inventor, to show what the future may look like in a sort of speculative type of way. But really what it is it's a canvas for me to sort of tell any type of story I wanted to tell. There's an action story in it. There's a love story in it. There's literally a Christmas story in it. There's all kinds of different things that hopefully enrich the world in a way that makes it feel a little bit more real, a little bit more lived in. And so that was sort of the idea behind Dandelion. And I've been working on it for quite some time. I think the first time I had the idea for it may have gone back to 2019, I'm trying to think, maybe 2020, at which point the first artist I hired was an artist named Martin Morazzo, whose work on a horror series called Ice Cream Man I was very impressed by. And he happened to be available and was interested in contributing to it. And then we were off to the races. And then one by one, I sort of found other artists that I was really excited about and got to keep expanding the world outwards.
Well, let's jump in on that for a moment. I mean, you start off with a cover by Tula Lote, and then you've got this awesome kind of lineup of artists. How did you go about recruiting all of these people to work on your graphic novel?
That was the hardest part because these artists are busy and they're, so I had to sort of be patient in terms of waiting for them. So I think for Vanessa Del Rey, who's an incredibly talented artist and was busy already, she told me that she could do a story for me if I was willing to wait 7 or 8 months. And I said, sure, take your time, because I was busy with the TV work anyway. So I continued to kind of work on other things while I was waiting for these artists to become available to then take a crack at Dandelion. So I had the luxury of time and the fact that it was an anthology. So they only had to commit to doing 7 pages or 10 pages or then another 6 pages, maybe a year later. So I could kind of plug in the gaps in their own schedules. And that was how I was able to assemble all these artists together. Otherwise, I don't think it would have happened if I needed each of them to do whatever it was, 22 pages or more. So I felt that the anthology format was actually very helpful in getting these artists, as long as I was on my own schedule and could take years to put it together.
And could you explain briefly to the audience who may not understand the process here, when you're recruiting these artists and putting this book together, how do you go about presenting it to Image? What does Image expect from you when you come to them with the idea for this?
I think Image's expectations are at least 5 pages and a cover. Now, when you're doing an anthology, it's a little bit trickier, because what I don't want to do is show them 5 pages of one story, but then say, oh, but the rest of the 120 pages is all by other different artists. So I actually ended up doing something like 60 to 80 pages, I think, by the time I'd put it all together from these different artists. And the reason I did that is because I knew I was committed to telling this story one way or another, whether Image was going to publish it or another publisher, or I was going to self-publish it. I basically decided, well, I want to make comics, and I had the luxury to kind of use that time to assemble these comics no matter what. And then I was going to push them out regardless of who was going to help me do that or not. So I don't think I submitted all 60 pages, but I do think I put together basically a sample packet of the different stories, as well as a synopsis that sort of gave an overview of the entire view of what the overall story was going to be, because there is a sort of central mystery that runs sometimes in the background and sometimes in the foreground of all these stories, which is the mystery of what happened to the inventor of the Dandelion ships. That's kind of the thread that ties it all together. And so I think it focused on that, if I remember correctly. But then also gave a little bit of a prelude to say it will showcase these different styles of stories or different genres as well, and showcase that a little bit. And that was it, So I think it was about like 25 to 30 pages and maybe a 1 to 2 page synopsis of what the overall story was, and that was it.
And so it's coming out in June, and could you tell readers, I'm so used to print interviews, could you tell listeners where they can find the book and anything else that you'd like to throw in as a extra pitch for this project, which looks super interesting and exciting, has a lot of different art styles in it. So I'll turn the floor over to you for whatever else you'd like to add.
Yes, June 12th it comes out in comic stores. I believe June 25th it will be available in bookstores and on Amazon and all those other places. The only other thing I can add about it is that I was fortunate enough to get to share it with some of my collaborators in the MCU. So Oscar Isaac, the actor who plays Moon Knight, was one of them. And he said some very nice things about it and gave me a quote that I was able to sort of use and put on the back of the graphic novel. Iman Vellani, my longtime now collaborator on the Ms. Marvel comic series that I've been working with, and who also is, as I said, the lead actor for the Ms. Marvel series, she also read it and said some very kind things. So it's been fun to sort of gather quotes from people who play superheroes in the MCU and get to hear their thoughts on this original story of mine called Dandelion.
And so could we'll speak as vaguely as possible here. Is there anything else that you're working on in comics right now that you can tease?
More stuff from Marvel. I can say that.
Okay.
It has not been announced yet, so I can't really get into things that haven't been announced yet. But I do have more work coming up with Marvel Comics that will be coming out this year. I can say that. And one more thing that is going to be creator-owned that I hope is going to land end of this year, but I'm not entirely sure. but I cannot say what the publisher is for that one yet because it's a little early on that one. So yeah, unfortunately, I wish I could say more. More comics, definitely.
All right. But in the meantime, fans can find Dandelion in June. And if you haven't watched Miss Marvel or Moon Knight, those are all obviously still available. I don't know what your residual system is on those. Last question then before we let you out the door. Could you recommend another comic that you're currently reading that you'd like to tell fans is pretty cool who may not have read it?
Oh, I'd be happy to. I mean, on my pull list is a lot of things. As I mentioned, Ice Cream Man is one of them. I think that's a fantastic series. I've been reading The Batman First Night. I think that is an awesome series. I highly recommend. The Hunger and the Dusk by G. Willow Wilson. I believe that's with Boom. That's another great one.
That's one of my favorites.
Oh, nice.
Right now. Yeah, if you like fantasy, you need to be reading Hunger in the Dusk. Trade comes out soonish. Or around the same time, I think, as Dandelion.
Oh, that's great.
I'll have to check.
Yeah.
I'll check. But yes, that's a good one. Continue. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's all I got. But yeah, tons of really cool stuff out there.
Great. Well, thank you, Sabir, for your time. And again, everybody can find Dandelion from Image in June, and there's more info about it, including all of those pull quotes that you referenced on imagecomics.com. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much.
We are back. My name is Ryan Higgins, and joined, as always, by Kevin Sharp here. Once again, Kevin, hello.
Hello, Ryan.
Hello, Kevin. Hi. And we have two extremely special guests with us for this podcast episode. We have, the creators of Minor Threats, the wonderful comic from Dark Horse Comics, but you'll probably know them from many other things as well. Patton Oswalt and Jordan Blum, thank you guys very much for being on this podcast.
Hey, thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, glad to be here.
It's fantastic. Yeah, super happy to have you guys on. Big fan of Minor Threats. Really like the comic. And obviously, Patton, you guys have done, you've done a ton of great work. Big fan of Sandman. I want to talk to you about that in a little bit here.
Sure.
But first, when we talk to new guests on the podcast, we always like to ask them their secret origin of how they got into comic books. And obviously, you guys now create comic books as well. But as a fan, you guys fans of comics growing up. How'd you get into it? How'd you get into the whole, just the fandom end of comics? I always find that it's a pretty unique story, especially when it comes to creators and professionals when they, everyone kind of comes in different ways. I'd love to know how you guys got into just being fans of comics in the first place.
I mean, for me, it was just comics were everywhere when I was growing up, and I loved them. I loved the colors and the superheroes. As I got older, and especially in high school, when The Dark Knight Returns came out, that really kind of opened up because I was also just a big reader. I just read a lot of novels, and to me, they were always very separate. And then Dark Knight is what led me down the path of Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman, all those writers that were combining novel and graphic art form. And it just blew me away. It just blew me away that you could do that with the form. I loved it.
Yeah, for me, my father was an immigrant and he learned English through comic books. So they were just there the day I was born. I think there's pictures of me in a high chair reading like a Mark Grunwald Captain America. Same thing. My mom would take me to the library and I just run to the comic rack. It was love at first sight. And I think I grew up during that era of all the toys too, like Superpowers and Secret Wars and stuff. So I would, reenact the comics with the toys and they were, like Patton said, they were just everywhere. And then, got into my Wednesday routine. And I think somewhere around, I was an X-Men fan, like Executioner Song. I was like, I must come every week to get the trading cards that come with the comic and see why did Cable shoot Professor X and all this stuff. And, I think once you commit to, having them pull a comic for you, you're in, you're hooked. That's it.
Oh yeah. Must be a big fan of the new X-Men 97 cartoon on right now. If you haven't started watching that.
Loving it. Yeah. My kids and I get up every Wednesday early. They will get up early before school and we will eat sugar cereal and try and recreate that feeling.
That Saturday morning cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Jordan may have tipped his hand on this what I was about to ask, but I'll ask anyway. Were you guys, did you fall on one side or another, either through the comics you read or the merch, the pajamas, the Halloween costume, posters, whatever it is, Marvel or DC? When you look back now, was there a preference?
Ooh, you mean in terms of like the look of things? Oh, for me, it just depended on the character and how cool that was. So I wasn't like, I like DC merch or I like Marvel merch. It was, Jordan is way more of a collector of merch and figures than I am. Let's give him that one.
I was mercurial. I love both. I can't tell you why one would be better than the other. They've been both a part of my life since I was little. And I think sometimes one publisher is doing better work than the other, but, they really swing back and forth. And I have favorite characters in both universes. I never understood like pitting them against each other or saying, I'm a Marvel guy or I'm a DC guy, because you're just starving yourself from really great stories, from one publisher to the other. So I never understood the rivalry thing. It was like, you win if you read both.
Yeah.
Well, especially once you start getting into the 80s and 90s, I feel like there was such a change. Marvel for a long time was just so dominant, right? I mean, what Patton was talking about with Dark Knight and Watchmen, right, and Sandman, everything kind of changed DC at that point. And so, for myself, that was kind of my, the Vertigo comics were my big change away from the superhero stuff when I was growing up and a teenager. And I was like, oh, comics, and this is kind of nothing. And then I read Invisibles and Sandman and, Watchmen and things like that. And I was like, oh, this is incredible. And that's what kept me going. I've heard from so many people through the years that, read when they're younger, kind of get out for a while, college, girls, jobs, all that stuff, and kind of get back in later. Do you guys read consistently and kind of keep tabs most of the time, or were you kind of in and out a little bit? And especially with all the movies and shows now, and obviously, Patton, you've been involved in some of them. Has that affected any of your reading, like kind of in the modern day?
I mean, I was pretty steady Eddie from high school on. There was a time in the 90s when I was started to do a lot of stand up, and quite frankly, there was a chunk of the 90s that was just not that good. It became, because it was such a fad, it became more of a collectory thing. And I thought the quality kind of sank a little bit. But then once I got to the late 90s again, it really, then there was the crash, and the people that stayed with it were the people that really loved comics and liked writing them. And then things got great again. So, but I mean, I've always been reading something. Right now is an amazing time for comics. So, but yeah, it's been kind of up and down a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think I ever fell off. I just expanded. I think I kept reading the same amount of superhero movies or superhero books, and then I also added things like Preacher or Why the Last Man or Sam, and I think now, even especially Pat, I feel like you have your finger on the pulse more of like the indie scene. So I'm constantly adding even more whenever we talk.
Yes, exactly. And Jordan is really good at going, I know that you look at it and go, oh, Micronauts, who cares? But the guy doing it is doing something really cool right now. Or this Transformers thing is actually as a writer doing something. So he clues me into the great gold that's hidden in a lot of what looks like disposable merchandising stuff. And that's really valuable, because that's how a lot of great writers get their start.
Well, I think when the industry kind of suffers, that's when really good stuff comes out. At the end of the 90s, after the Marvel's bankruptcy and all that, the big comic store crash. Yeah, I mean, but you still had Preacher and Why the Last Man and Transmetropolitan, and these things that may never have been lasted 7 issues, but now all of a sudden they're these these kind of major hits for publishers as they go on. And Marvel brought in like Joe Quesada and Kevin Smith to redo Daredevil, and that completely kind of reinvigorated Marvel. And that's it's actually a good question for you guys too. I mean, we've seen some people come in from Hollywood, they'll kind of come and dip their toes in comics. A lot of people from comics go the other way. For Minor Threats, kind of going from becoming fans, even though you guys have professional careers, what sort of brought you in to work on Minor Threats now as opposed to, previous times? You feel like the last couple of years, like some opportunities open, something you wanted to do, or is this just like just the opportunity presented itself and you're like, yeah, let's make some comics?
Well, I feel like well, it starts with MODOK. Yeah, like I know there's always like the joke of like people are trying to write comics and then break into TV or film, but we were the opposite. We created a Marvel show just so we could write a Marvel comic.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we leapt it. We pitched them. Hey, can we do this? Like, yeah, if you want. And that let us kind of cut our teeth a little bit in the Marvel universe together. Patton had written previously some DC stuff as well, and a few other things. But that's where we met Scott Hepburn, who would go on to co-create Minor Threats with us. But I think we were so hungry after that. And then Pat, if you want to talk about like Dark Horse reaching out and how that all started.
Yeah, I mean, I had always, Dark Horse, I did a single issue of Black Hammer and got to know, the people over there. And I'd also done some other like little one-shot stuff with Dark Horse. And they were like, hey, if you ever have like a story? So I was telling Jordan about this Batman story that I had, but I'd done so much work with the majors at that point, just guesting stuff. And Jordan put it really well. They don't really let you break the toys. You're not allowed to go that crazy with them. That's valuable IP that you're doing stories with. So there's always a state of grace. Like, yes, you can have crazy things happen, but at the end, things have to go back to normal because that's what the IP is. So this Batman story I had where the Joker breaks out and the Bat family is coming down like a ton of bricks on all the lower level villains in Gotham, that sparked Jordan's head going, well, why don't we just create a universe out of this? So that, I was like, oh, that's something to take to Dark Horse. And we did. And we never looked back. We ran with it and it's been great from the get-go.
Yeah, I think, we're very aware too of the TV film people who moonlight as comic writers and try to take their pilots or whatever and cram them into a 4-issue series. And we were very much, this is a different format. We want to write the best comic possible. This was designed to be a comic book. It's not some other project, or we're not trying to use it to get somewhere else. We were just like, let's write a comic as if no one will ever let us write a comic again. And we've been reading since we were kids, and what's every idea we've been sitting on that we want to see and do in a comic universe, and it just kind of spilled out of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been working and owning the shop for a long time now, and I've seen, a lot of that in the past, and customers can kind of, I feel like they can sort of sense that this is a TV pitch. This is a pilot. This isn't really a comic that's going to be around for a while, and it never really works. That's why I think it's when you come at it from like, no, this is a comic first, and if something happens later, whatever, that's cool. But but this is what we want first. I really resonates with people.
Yeah, what can you only do in comic books that you can't do in anything else? Though?
Yeah, we didn't want to publish like storyboards, basically.
Right.
Yeah. And I agree. You can sniff that out, I feel like, as a reader really as well.
Just like you could always sniff out in stand-up actors or actresses that were like, oh, I'll just do stand-up for a while and that'll lead me to, like they're not actually in it because they like stand-up.
When you guys decided to pivot off that Batman idea into Minor Threats, what was the process, the creative process like for kind of hashing all of that out? Had you kind of developed a routine on MODOK, a working routine, or what was your process once you decided, let's create our brand new universe that's never been seen before?
I think it was cracking Frankie was the big thing. I had written a giant screenplay years ago that would never get made. That was an original character supervillain heist thing. And I think I took some elements of that, and we took some ideas I know that Patton had. And once we kind of figured out the like second generation supervillain who feels like she was trapped in this world and wants to escape, we kind of we use that into the kind of Batman story that Patton had already kind of figured out. And I think when we kind of put those two things together, it gave it a lot of life. And then from there, it was kind of trying to figure out who are the most interesting characters to put with her. What are types of these D-list characters that we loved, looking at the rogues and Batman's, rogue gallery and Spider-Man's and kind of investigating the types, of characters that populate these worlds. And then I want to say, Scott Hepburn's designs mixed with the world building he was doing of creating this superhero city that's endured 60 years of superhero continuity. And what does that look like when there's no damage control to clean up the next day? That really started to kind of transform the story into something bigger.
Right.
Yeah, there's definitely kind of a lot of Justice League International and Suicide Squad elements. I could see that. A little bit of like Astro City, Kingdom Come. So,
sure.
Astro City, definitely. massive influence.
Yeah, pulling from some really, really good stuff.
Yeah.
But it was like a love letter to these kinds of characters. I think we like these people who were goofy Silver Age villains who were never intended to do more than just show up and be the villain of the month, and then to figure out who these people were and what their lives were and what tragedies led them to be stuck in this life of super crime. I think that's what we really wanted to explore, and really leaning into crime fiction as sort of the subgenre of what we were telling.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have a new book coming out that's part of the Minor Threats universe, Barfly, which is even more kind of through the looking glass a little bit. It's the random character in your universe that you're now fleshing out.
Yeah. Pat, you want to talk about like Scott's creation of Barfly and
we have an artist, H. Scott Hepburn, who the way that he populates the background. Jordan had this amazing phrase, which is, we want to have a city that's gone through 60 years of comic continuity. What would that look like? So that you can see that evidences of past battles and interdimensional incursions. And in that world, there are a lot of little leftover characters that are just trying to survive. So he drew this human fly punk rock hybrid thing sitting at the bar, and we just fell in love with him, but not as deeply as Kyle Starks did, who his name was Shit Eater. He never even speaks. He's never named. And Kyle pitched us this whole thing, and it's so cool. And that's also happened with Tim Seeley's The Alternates. He was thinking of, well, what's this world's version of getting Vertigoized, getting adult contentized, and then going back to 4-panel, 4-color world. What does that do to a character? So there's been all those the fact that we're inspiring people is pretty amazing.
What's your do you guys have a routine, or how do you decide when you're co-writing on a series? Who does what, I guess, is the easiest way to ask it. How does the workload get divided up on I'm just because I don't think we've ever interviewed on here a comic that has 2 writers.
Mm-hmm. We break the story together, and a lot of times we just write together, and then sometimes we'll just pass it back and forth. We've been working together for a while now, so we clearly love the same things. It's very easy to convince each other of an idea and then run with it. And obviously the goal for both Pat and I is just to write cool things for Scott to draw and make him shine. That should be every comic writer's goal, is how can I make my artist look amazing?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's cool to kind of build that world. We've seen, you brought up Astro City before, right? I mean, you take the Marvel and DC worlds, and there's, at the end of the day, I mean, I love Marvel and DC, but there is only so much you can do with some of this. Occasionally I'll have a customer to be like, one of these days they're just going to kill the Joker, right? And I'm like, yeah, but if they really do, then the Joker's gone forever. I mean, obviously not, it's comics, but the idea, if the Joker is gone forever, that's a problem for the IP of a major multinational corporation. If you guys want to kill your Joker, you can just do it, right? So there's a interesting, the boys obviously have had a lot of success with that as well. Garth Ennis, Derek Robertson series and the show, right? So it's like, when you take that Marvel and DC template, and then you're able to kind of twist it yourself, right? It's your own like real kind of, it's like a real effects of the world. Death was killed so long ago in comics with the whole Superman fiasco. But that's the thing of with the major IPs, which is these are that'd be like going, I'm going to run the McDonald's Corporation, and when I'm done with it, no more burgers. I have this really radical idea, and like, but that's the only way the corporation exists if we have these. But I think with smaller indie comics, you get readers that are okay with the state of grace being disrupted constantly. And the one thing that's really interesting about Minor Threats is characters die, but and you've gone through this, like if someone dies, they're not really gone. Not that we're ever going to bring them back, but the effects of them are always there, and the effects of the people around them are always there. And it would have been really, it would have been so ballsy. DC can't do this. If when they killed Superman, he actually stayed dead, and they created an even bigger universe, and there's this overhanging, Superman becomes like a Martin Luther King or a JFK. He's this weird mythic figure, and how does he affect other people around him? And there's people that are like, it was a conspiracy. Like it makes the character even bigger in a way, but I understand why they can't do that. Right.
Yeah, I feel like the book, really leans into kind of a little bit of what people's knowledge is of superheroes. Obviously, we're sending them up, or there's a lot of riffs, like you mentioned, the boys, even Watchmen. But I think our goal was also to do something that like was full of love as we deconstruct it. We're not here to be like, this is silly, this was stupid, or look at how dumb the idea of superheroes. I'm not saying those other books do that, but I think we wanted to do a deconstruction that was like, isn't this stuff great? Isn't the Silver Age insane? We love it. Isn't like this rebooting and the multiverse also, aren't these concepts incredible? And that was kind of always the idea of to break down why we love these things, but make sure it's clear we love these things.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting comic, because I feel we're in an interesting state right now with not only the comic industry but also the comic movies and TV shows and media. And I feel some of the kind of backlash, at least from the fans that are actual comic fans, people that come in the shop and everything. The thing I hear a lot about is that when they don't take the comics seriously, things don't always. There's maybe this something that gets lost in translation, and I feel like when the media properties come in and they're like, no, we love this stuff too, and we're as goofy as some of it can be, we're going to take this as serious as we can. I think X-Men '97 I brought up earlier is actually a perfect example of that. It could have been terrible, but they really are treating that stuff, the comics and the original show as serious as I think you could possibly treat it. And I think it really it translates really well. And it, for the people who have spent their lives, reading this stuff and being fans of it, I think they appreciate that when they're not laughing. You can laugh with someone, but it's not great when you're laughing at them.
Well, I feel like comic booky was a dirty word, right? For a while, where it was like, put the X-Men in black leather. And to me, comic booky means like grounding, like having a very serious character driven story in the impossible, and having it in this big fantasy template. Like, it's a great example to me. I love the James Gunn Suicide Squad, where it's like, that's a talking weasel, moving on. Like, you don't need to hold anyone's hand. It's just like, this is the world we're playing in, but we're going to take it seriously when we need to, but also we're going to embrace the absurdity of comics, and that's what makes them fun.
Exactly.
Right. Well, before we let you go, I have to ask Patton.
Hold on, I know where you're going to go. I know where you're going to go. Before we leave Minor Threats, I got to hit him. I got to hit him with this hypothetical.
Yeah.
Just hearing it about as this is a love letter to the Silver Age, here's my hypothetical for both of you. Imagine a Minor Threats 80-page super spectacular annual, whatever you want to call it. It can be illustrated by any artist from the history of comics who is either deceased or retired from the business. So we avoid playing any current favorites. Who's your dream artist for a one-shot?
Oh, man.
Putting him on the spot.
I'm
asking the easy questions.
I'll go first, Pat, and give you a tap. Because I've just been reading some Teen Titans, and man, a George Perez Minor Threats would have been incredible. So that's mine.
Mine is, because we haven't really gone that far into what this world's golden age actually looked like. There's little hints of it. We've gone into the Silver Age. I would love to do a golden age Twilight City book, and Darwin Cook is the artist.
Oh yeah.
Just because also I want to own some goddamn Darwin Cook art. That guy, it's for selfish and aesthetic reading. And also, by the way, this isn't someone who's not, he's technically not dead, but if I could coax somebody back into the superhero world, Dave Mazzucchelli doing that would mean everything. His art, oh my God. Why did he go away? Dave, come back.
Well, now I'm kind of sorry I asked the question.
When they were doing that Hawkeye book and they were just aping Dave Mazzucchelli's style, I'm like, you know what? I'll take it. I'll take the methadone if I can't get the heroin. This is fine with me, man. Oh,
can make some phone calls. Get him back. Get him back to do something.
I hear he won't do it.
The comics industry is, notoriously burned quite a few people through the years. I don't know if that's his case, but yeah, you brought up Alan Moore a few times. He not coming back.
I was restricting myself to deceased or retired because I didn't want to step on any secret announcement that may be coming around the corner. But now that I've asked it, I'm sorry I did, because now I want to see those comics.
Well, we've been very lucky. If you see the covers and some of the upcoming covers, we've been hitting a lot of those people that were like, well, they probably won't draw a book, but maybe we can get them to draw the characters on the cover. We're very greedy when it comes to covers. I have Jeff Darrow's contact information, but Jeff Darrow feels like save that for a amazing moment. You know what I mean? Like, don't just because a Jeff Darrow to me would be amazing.
That's one for the wall.
That's a good one.
Well, Patton, before we let you go, I do have to ask about Sandman. Sure. Obviously, you talked earlier, it seems like you were a fan, in your earlier days of comic reading. It is a, fan of all of us on the podcast. And I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, taking this stuff seriously. And there came, Sandman was trying to, Neil Gaiman said, let's take these weird concepts that were kind of goofy stuff and let's do it serious. It was kind of that one of those first real big breakthrough books. And I feel the show did. I don't know how you do it much better. Sandman feels unfilmable, and Gaiman seems like he passed on a ton of opportunities to do it in the past, and this is the one that stuck. This is the one that stuck. So, you've done a ton of voice acting, for Marvel properties and DC properties, but Matthew the Raven, that to me, forget Superman and Spider-Man, let's talk about Matthew the Raven. I mean, what kind of, was that a cool experience? Like, I've got to imagine that's a...
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's also just amazing when I'm doing the voiceover over scenes where even when the effects aren't finished, the way that they've built the world and the elements of it, that they build as much as they can. They want as many practical sets as they can because it makes the actors act differently if they're actually on a set rather than if they're against a green blanket. But when you see how artistic they are with building the world with what they have and what they don't, and I'm literally just seeing panels that I remember reading growing up in front of me, in front of my eyes. It's just surreal. And then also I always had a kind of a, in my mind, and I know this because of the movie A Boy and His Dog, but I've always in my mind imagined Tim McIntyre's, his voice kind of sounds like that. So I try to give it a little bit of Tim McIntyre feel because I love that guy's voice. But also in my head, I know that this is Matthew Cable, and so there's just so much. I don't know. It sometimes it feels like I won a radio contest or something.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating character, and yeah, I mean, you guys did a great job, and I'm so excited for season 2 and everything else I got coming up. So yeah,
I can't wait. I can't wait. Even if it wasn't in the show, I'd be equally as excited because it's Sandman.
Yeah. I waited when it dropped on Netflix. I was like, I'm not doing this. I watched it every week, once a week, and I acted like it was just a regular, normal old TV show where they would come on one episode a week. And I'm like, no, I'm going to savor this as long as possible. And so that's going to be my viewing method for this going forward. No binging Sandman. I know Netflix says they want the numbers up front, but I'm sorry, like I have been waiting for this my entire life, and I need it to take as long as possible because it's like, just please, I want more Sandman, and I want it done right. So they did. They nailed it. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
Before we let them go, Ryan, and do a final plug for the book, Pat and I told Ryan if he asked about Sandman, I got to ask about Pip the Troll. So my question is not what was the experience like. My question is, what was your history with that character? Because I know you mentioned reading Sandman in real time, but what about Pip the Troll, who was kind of off stage for many years before the Eternals?
I mean, it was a last minute thing. They just called and said, "Do you want to do this?" I was like, "Oh, hell yeah!" I mean, I was more excited to get to work with Chloe Zhao because she's like one of my favorite directors of all time. I've seen all of her films, and I think she's brilliant. So. Yeah, I mean, it was a combination of, I get to be in a Marvel film. I get to work with Chloe. Holy shit, So it was a combination of that.
Were you familiar with him from the books at all?
Yeah, I mean, he had shown up in. He's like a Howard the Duck or a. He's like this beloved character that like serious writers and artists are like, well, I'm going to put him in there, and I'm going to like. It's almost the way that like chefs will go. I'm going to work with the cheapest fish or the cheapest cut of meat, but I'm going to make it amazing to show off how good I am. So he was in a. There was a run of X-Force, with the one where Madrox was running the detective agency. Do you remember that one? Pip was working in the office, and it was just really cool. So I was like, all right, yeah, I'm going to be Pip the Troll, man. I'm going to embrace this.
I feel like Infinity Gauntlet was such a defining book of the 90s. That was my introduction, where I think like a whole generation was like, this guy's important. Anyone who was in Infinity Gauntlet was important. Like from there on out, like.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It is funny to talk to people and be like, yeah, my grandmother knows who Drax is, and that's a really bizarre thing. Like, so I'm not sure I like my grandmother knowing who people in Infinity Gauntlet were. That just seems odd to me, but okay. Well, it was awesome having you guys on. Super, super cool. Really excited for the new Minor Threats book. It is out July, I believe. I believe that's correct. Barfly?
Yeah, Barfly comes out July. Minor Threats Volume 2 is currently out right now. New issue comes out this Wednesday, issue 2. And then the alternates, trade paperback just got released last week. Yep. So there's tons of Minor Threats for you to discover. Volume 1's available, all that stuff.
Fantastic. Well, looking forward to that. Looking forward to anything else you guys. Definitely Sandman season 2, Patton. I'm there.
Thanks so much.
You're watching day 1. Looking forward to that. And that was Jordan, Patton. Thank you guys very, very much.
Thanks, guys.
And, thank you so much for having us on. Seriously, thanks, guys. It was really cool.
This was a blast. Thank you, guys.